Good afternoon. We're going to continue our conversations on South Carolina history, and today I'll be talking about the Carolina backcountry and an individual who chronicled it in the days and years before the American Revolution, the Reverend Charles Wood Mason. I'd like to start off with just a brief overview, again reminding you of what was the Carolina backcountry. It was an area that was very large. Its terrain was markedly different from that of the low country. There were hills, rolling hills, lots of forest, and unlike the frontiers of other colonies, primarily the settlers for our Carolina backcountry didn't land in Charleston and then go to the frontier. They came in through the back door, so to speak, primarily from western Pennsylvania, predominantly Scots-Irish and German, with a few English settlers who joined the wagon trains, and they were wagon trains, south into the Carolinas. There were poorer folks seeking a better way of life, and we've already talked earlier about the Scots-Irish, who they were. Scots settled in Ireland, staunchly Protestant, and then they moved to Pennsylvania. And they were actually recruited by the Quakers of Pennsylvania to settle on the frontier. But because they settled on the frontier, they began to have difficulties with the Native Americans. And the Quaker government, which did not believe in violence, automatically assumed that the Scots-Irish settlers were the cause of the problem. They were probably right, but if you're a settler on the frontier and the government back home says the people attacking your house are really the good guys, the Scots-Irish in Pennsylvania decided maybe we ought to find another place to live. And so they heard about the tremendous generosity of South Carolina's land grants, and they began to come south. In fact, it was called the Great Wagon Road. It went from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, through the Shenandoah Valley, down into the Piedmont of the Carolinas, pretty much stopped at the Waxhaws, although some trickled on over to present-day Abbeville County. Andrew Jackson's folks stopped in the Waxhaws. John C. Calhoun's family went all the way over to Abbeville. They poured into the colony during the 1750s, so that by 1765, 2/3 of the white population of South Carolina resided in the backcountry. And again, it was the land grants. They could get 50 to 500 acres of land, and so they had settlements stretching from Abbeville all the way over to present-day York County. They called it in those days New Acquisition, but that's present-day York County. Now, they didn't escape the Indians. The Cherokee went to war with the colony in the 1760s, and the surprise attack at the Long Canes killed Calhoun's grandmother, among others. And there was no peace after the war. Outlaw bands roamed the countryside, eventually suppressed by a vigilante movement called the Regulators. And there was tremendous hostility towards the low country for its neglect of the backcountry. For example, the General Assembly, the Commons House of Assembly, which was made up primarily of folks from the low country, decided to spend, in today's money, about $140,000 on a statue of William Pitt, when the folks in the backcountry had asked, could you please help fund school books and Bibles for our children? Life in the backcountry was described during this time by Charles Wood Mason, an Anglican missionary. His views are not neutral. They depend upon the background of those who hear and read his words on issues of race, nationality, class, section, religion, and family. People are either amused or offended. So I'm giving you your warning. First of all, Wood Mason was an Englishman, an Anglican, a gentleman, and a person of learning. As an Englishman, he carried with him national prejudices and the memory of a social and political order in sharp contrast with what he termed the state of nature of the backcountry. And as an Anglican, he not only shared denominational biases of his day, but he despaired at its failure of his church to maintain itself on the frontier. Now, a little bit more about the man, because he really is a fascinating individual. He was English, said that. And historians now pretty much assured that he came from the gentry class, the country gentleman, the country squire. He grew up in London. About 1752, he came out to South Carolina. At some point, not as a clergyman at first, at some point, an injury received from a horse's kick left him unfit for nuptial rites, and his wife remained in England, and she never joined him out here. Soon after he arrived, he began buying land in the Speedy area, and for about 10 years he lived in Prince Frederick's Parish, becoming a church warden in 1756. In the absence of the rector, he read prayers and a sermon each Sunday, and he was elected to the vestry in 1757, and the next year the governor appointed him a justice of the peace. In 1762, he returned to England, and he came back to South Carolina and settled in Charleston. Late in 1765, he applied for the position of itinerant Anglican minister in St. Mark's Parish. Now, sometime between 1762 and 1765 in England, he obviously was ordained to the clergy. Since there was no Church of England bishop in the colonies, he had to go to England for ordination, and he returned with his license to preach. Over time, he became a supporter of the backcountry, the regulator movement, and he protested the injustices that the people of the backcountry faced at the hands of low-country politicians. He labored for the relief of the poor, the needy, the stranger, and he worked for their improvement. He was committed to the advancement of religion, the goodness of the church, and the suppression of what he said was idleness, beggary, profaneness, and lewdness. In 1773, with the missionary efforts of Baptists and Presbyterians in the backcountry, he gave up South Carolina and moved to England, and in 1774 he returned home there. But he left an incredible record of South Carolina in years before the Revelation. As a gentleman, he looked at those around him in the wilderness with the measuring rod that frequently found them lacking. As a man of learning, eager for conversation, he felt alone in the wilderness. Wood Mason was more than just a recorder of events and an Anglican missionary. He viewed himself not only as a defender of the church and a winner of souls, but as a missionary of English civilization. So, let's see what Mr. Wood Mason had to say about things. And for the most part, the next part of my conversation, you're going to be hearing from Charles Wood Mason. First of all, he wanted people who came to hear him how they should behave in church. I've actually threatened when I was in the vestry to have every vestry person read the same thing. But always contrive to come before service begins, which you may do as our services are late. But if it's inevitable that you're going to be late, pray enter leisurely, tread softly, do not disturb any who are on their knees and are intent on their devotions. Bring no dogs with you because they can be very troublesome. And I shall inform the magistrate of those who do it, for it is an affront to the divine presence. When you are seated, do not whisper, talk, gaze about, or show light airs or behavior. I think I still may send this to the vestry. For this argues a wandering mind and irreverence towards God, is unbecoming religion, and may give scandal and offense to weak Christians. Neither sneeze or cough if you can avoid it, and do not practice that unseemly, rude, indecent custom of chewing or spitting, which is very ridiculous and absurd in public. And it's especially in women in God's house. If you're thirsty, pray drink before you enter. You know, I'm sorry, I got my aside. People carrying their bottles of water to church now. I mean, come on, give me a break, folks. You need to do what Mr. Woodmason said. Pray drink before you enter or before service begins, not go out in the midst of prayer, nor be running to and fro, except your necessary occasions should oblige you. And remember, we Anglicans sing. If you don't know the tunes, listen. Oh, and as for sermons, I don't do extemporaneous preaching. He said, I will write them out. Now, many of you, I know, prefer extemporaneous sermons to those which are premeditated, and may call my mode of delivery reading rather than preaching. Now, it is true extemporaneous discourses have their particular merit, but there's hardly one man in the world but will speak better and more sense when it's premeditated rather than extemporaneous. When the banns of marriage are published, don't make it a matter of sport, but let it stir up you a petition to heaven for a blessing of God upon the parties. Because Woodmason, as more than one other Anglican clergyman and clergymen of all denominations found, when marriage bans were proposed, very frequently the bride was already with child. So, he talked about everything. On backcountry food, he was in the Shiraz on January 1767. Had a congregation of 500, that's pretty good. Baptized 60 children. I was quite jaded out, standing and speaking 6 hours altogether, and nothing to refresh me but water, and their provisions, which I would not touch. All the cookery of these people being exceedingly filthy and most execrable. On one of the other missionary denominations in the backcountry, the Presbyterians. This day we have a specimen of envy, malice, and temper of the Presbyterians. They gave away 2 barrels of whiskey to the populace to make them drink and to disturb the service. For this being the first time that the communion was ever celebrated in this wild part of the world, it gave great alarm and caused them much pain and vexation. The company got drunk by 10 o'clock, and we could hear them firing, hooping, and howling like Indians. Some few came before the communion was finished, were very noisy, and I would have had them punished if I could have identified them. And another time, they have a schoolmaster at this place, an old Presbyterian fellow, or between that and a Quaker. They send their children to him readily and pay him, but they would not send their children to me. And I would have done it gratis. Such is their attachment to their kirk. Some call me a Jesuit, and the liturgy, the Mass. I have observed what tricks they would have played on Christmas Day to have disturbed the people, and I will mention another. Not long after, they hired a band of rude fellows to come to service, who brought with them 57 dogs, for I counted every one. Which in time and service they set to fighting, and I was obliged to stop. In time of sermon they repeated it, and I was obliged to desist and dismiss the people. It's vain to take up or commit these lawless ruffians, for they have nothing, and the charge of sending them to Charlestown would take me a year's salary. We are without any law or order, as are all the magistrates or Presbyterians. I could get a warrant, but if I got a warrant, all the constables are Presbyterians likewise. I could not get them. What I could not effect by force or reason, I have done by sarcasm. For at the time when they sent the fellows with their dogs, one of the dogs followed me down here, which I carried to the house of one of the principals, and told him that I had 57 Presbyterians come to church that Sunday, and I had converted one of them and brought him home. I left the dog with him. This joke has made them extremely angry, and they would cut my throat, but I have gained my aim, having had no more disturbance from the Presbyterians. On the lack of religious feeling in the backcountry. The open profanation of the Lord's Day in this province is one of the most crying sins in it. And he was talking about the backcountry, but it was equally true in Charleston and the Low Country. And it's carried to a great height. Among the low class, it is abused by hunting, fishing, fowling, and racing, by the women in frolicking and wantonness, by others in drinking bouts and card playing. Even in and about Charleston, the taverns have more visitants than the churches. On conducting a service in a non-Anglican manner, it's been a common taunt by the dissenters, that is, people who are not Anglicans. They were called dissenters, so we talk about Presbyterians, Quakers, and Baptists, that the church ministers could not preach or pray extemporaneously as their teachers did, and the Episcopalians begged me to preach to convince these gainsayers to the contrary, whose request I complied with. My prayer and sermon was 1 hour and a quarter. This is the first time of attempting anything of this sort, and I acquitted myself greatly to their satisfaction. The dissenters were confounded and astonished, and the church people pleased and delighted. 1 hour and 15 minutes. On the morality of the backcountry. In consequence of a promise made, set off this morning for a guide to Flat Creek. Here I found a vast body of people assembled. Such a medley, such a mixed multitude of all classes and complexions I never saw. I baptized about 20 children and married 4 couples. Most of the people had never before seen a minister or heard the Lord's Prayer, service, or sermon in their days. I was a great curiosity to them, and they were as great oddities to me. After service, they went to reveling, drinking, singing, dancing, and whoring, and most of the company were drunk before I quitted the spot. They were as rude in their manners as the common savages, and hardly a degree removed from them. And he had something to say about everything. What about how people dressed? It would be, as I once observed before, a great novelty to Londoners to see one of these congregations. The men with only a thin shirt and a pair of breeches or trousers, bare-legged and barefooted, because remember, in the 18th century, men, even working class men in Charleston in the cities, wore knee breeches and stockings. Working class didn't wear silk stockings, but they wore stockings or hose. The women bareheaded, bare-legged, and barefoot, with only a thin shift and under petticoat. Yet I cannot break them of this, for the heat of weather admits not much more clothing, and I can hardly bear the weight of my wig and gown during service. The young women have a most uncommon practice, which I cannot break them of. They draw their shift as tight as possible to the body and pin it close to show the roundness of their breasts and slender waists, for they are generally fine-shaped. Now you notice he got that. They were fine-shaped, and draw their petticoat close to their hips and show the fineness of their limbs so that they might as well be naked. Indeed, nakedness is not censurable or indecent here, and they expose themselves often quite naked and without ceremony, rubbing themselves in their hair with bare oil and tying it up in a bunch like the Indians, being hardly 1 degree removed from them. In a few years, I hope to bring about a reformation, as I've already done in several other parts of the country. As I mentioned earlier, he was concerned about the poor, and he made a comment about orphans in the backcountry. Usually if a child lost parents, hopefully there was a relative to take them in. If not, there really wasn't anybody unless a kind neighbor would take them. He said, "There's not yet a law ordinance in this province, wherefore they are generally plundered and devoured. No law in respect to transient persons dying here or securing their effects. Everything is booty for robbery. Nor is any regulation about the land. People just squat. They don't bother to get a land grant." Now, he couldn't stay away from the talk of religion, and that's, I'll be honest, that has always fascinated me, because a lot of denominational histories kind of skate over this period of their history in South Carolina, at least the way the congregations behaved. The sectarians, and that means anybody who was not an Anglican, seeing the insensibility and reluctance of the legislature to settle churches and ministers on the plan of the establishment, have been very alert to settle themselves in every hole and corner where they could raise congregations. That's eventually one of the reasons that Wood Mason would leave the colony in 1774, is that with the established church, the government was supposed to pay for the building of a church or a chapel and pay the clergyman's salary. Having built upward of 20 meeting houses, now that's obviously the sectaries, and formed large societies, they've entered into strict union for the depressing of the church and preventing the introduction of the episcopal ministry. Great and successful have their endeavors been here. Not less than 20 itinerant Presbyterian, Baptist, and independent preachers are maintained by the synods of Pennsylvania and New England to traverse this country, poisoning the minds of the people, instilling democratical and commonwealth principles into their minds, embittering them against the very name of bishops and all episcopal government, and laying deep and very fatal republican notions and principles, especially that they owe no subjugation to Great Britain. Now that's an interesting comment. He's saying the sectarians are preaching, don't say God save the king. That they are a free people, that they do not pay allegiance to King George as their sovereign, but as to Great Britain or the Parliament, and they have no more to think of them than they do of the Turks. Thus do these itinerant preachers sent from the northern colonies. You see, that's interesting. He talks about it was the synods of Pennsylvania and New England who were sending missionaries south. Thus do these itinerant preachers sent from the northern colonies pervert the minds of the vulgar. Nor are the Quakers and other inferior sects backward. They have too their traveling missionaries, and many Romanish priests passed unnoted to visit the covert papists under the guise of Quakers and New Lights. For literally over 100 years, historians ignored the fact that there were Roman Catholics in South Carolina prior to the American Revolution. Some suspected it, but here is an Anglican priest saying, in the backcountry, they're Roman priests, they're Catholic priests, going around taking care of their covert parishioners. Now you wonder how on earth they did that. This is, we can't pull out our phone and say, I'll meet you at such and such. Word of mouth, they knew where to go and support their religionism. The Moravians and other motley sets have also made an appearance this way, all of which would never have happened had the churches been properly funded and the ministers settled. Now, the Moravians in South Carolina is an interesting connection because the Great Wagon Road did go through Salem, North Carolina before it came south. And a trade pattern from Camden up to Salem continued well into the 19th century. Such a mixed medley of religions is hardly anywhere to be found here, not even in Philadelphia or Amsterdam. I mentioned earlier he described the food as exceedingly filthy and most execrable. At a later date, he got a little bit more descriptive of the food. In all of these excursions, I'm obliged to carry my own necessaries with me, as biscuit, cheese, a pint of rum, some sugar, chocolate, tea or coffee, with cups, knife, spoon, plate, towels, and linen, so that I always go heavily laden like a trooper. If I did not, I should starve. Never will I be out again from home for a month, together to take chances of things. As in many places, they have naught but a gourd to drink out of, not a plate knife or spoon, a glass, cup, or anything. It is well if they can get some body linen, and some not even that. They are often burdened with young children, that the women cannot attend both house and field, and many live by hunting, killing of the deer. There's not a cabin but has 10 or 12 young children in it. When the boys are 18 and girls 14, they marry, so that in many cabins you will see 10 or 15 children, children and grandchildren of one size, the mother looking as young as the daughter. Yet these poor people enjoy good health and are generally cut off from the diseases of the low country. And I think I'll go with one last look at religion. This chapter in his diary is called The New Light Baptists. People's brains are turned and bewildered. Instead of having any fixed abode, they, the New Light clergy, are continually ranging from river to river, devouring the fastings of the land. When one is gone, comes another and another. The want is that they don't all agree in one tune, for one sings this doctrine and the next a different, so that people's brains are turned and bewildered. But you may depend that they'll bring scripture for all that they assert, as one lately did in excuse for a woman who had robbed her husband to give to him, to the minister. He said she had a right to the money, the same as God has to everything. And as God bade the Israelites to borrow of the Egyptians without any intention of repaying them, so this woman was equally justifiable. The taking that money from him with which he was to pay the merchant for goods credited him was borrowing from the Egyptians to give to the Israelites. Rare doctrine this for the benefit of merchants. But I must observe that among all these gifted and spiritualized persons, all their quotations and metaphors are drawn entirely from the Old Testament. We never hear one passage from our Lord's divine Sermon on the Mount. The first article they begin with is to set the people against their several ministers, be they of whatever denomination, but especially against the established clergy. And that final passage would lead me to a comment, not a direct quote, but this is what an incident that he described. And that was the sectaries disliked one another as much as they disliked the established church. And at one point, and I must confess I tried to find it to bring it because it was embedded in my mind, he said that a Baptist would rather have his daughter marry an Episcopalian than a Presbyterian, or an Anglican than a Presbyterian. And a Presbyterian would rather have his daughter marry an Anglican than a Baptist. So, as I said when I started out, Mr. Woodmason's comments, how you received them, all I can say is he was a man of his times and who he was. And some of you have been a little bit amazed or maybe even offended. I apologize for that. But folks, all I did was say, I'm going to tell you what an Anglican priest thought about the backcountry of colonial South Carolina. Thank you, and I look forward to next week.